The COVID-19 inquiry is in full swing, with all of the key players involved in the decision-making process during the pandemic having been questioned or are due to be questioned over the decisions they took during the crisis. The inquiry itself is what's known as a statutory inquiry, with its primary aim to look at what went well, what didn't go so well, and what lessons can be learned, so if the UK has to deal with a similar situation, it is better prepared. Now, it's not a criminal body and is not tasked to look at whether or not people committed any criminal offences. If there is criminality that is uncovered, it would be referred to the police and investigated separately. Now, the appearance of former Prime Minister Boris Johnson and former Health Secretary Matt Hancock has drawn particular interest and scrutiny given the prominent roles that both of them played in the decision-making process. There are some, particularly on social media, who have called for both individuals to be prosecuted for an offence of misconduct in a public office, which is a criminal offence and is punishable by imprisonment and/or a fine. Now, in this video, I'm going to look at the offence of misconduct in a public office and highlight why, in my opinion, it is unlikely that a successful prosecution would ever be brought against Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock. Misconduct in a public office is what's known as a common law offence, meaning it has not been created by an Act of Parliament, such as an offence of theft or fraud. It is, however, still a criminal offence in its own right, and as I've previously mentioned, is punishable by imprisonment. Now, the offence itself, as stated on the Crown Prosecution Service website, concerns serious willful abuse or neglect of the power or responsibilities of the public office held. There must be a direct link between the misconduct and abuse of those powers or responsibilities, and the Court of Appeal has made it clear that the offence should be strictly confined and it can raise complex and sometimes sensitive issues. Now, there are four elements that make up the offence of misconduct in a public office, and they are as follows: a public officer acting as, willfully neglects to perform their duty and/or willfully misconducts themselves, to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder, and they do so without reasonable excuse or justification. Now, I'm going to go through these in a little bit more detail using the COVID-19 pandemic and the former Prime Minister and Health Secretary to illustrate this point with examples. If we look at the first element of the offence, a public officer acting as. Now, there is a list and some case law on what does and does not constitute a public officer. An elected member of Parliament clearly does fall within that definition. But if you look at the last two words of this element, acting as, this means that at the time the alleged misconduct took place, the individual must have been acting in their capacity as an MP. So if they were clearly acting in a private capacity, albeit while still being an MP, then they would not be acting as a public officer. In this scenario, however, there is no question that Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock were acting as public officers during their conduct during the COVID-19 pandemic. The second element of the offence of misconduct in a public office is that someone willfully neglects to perform their duty and/or willfully misconducts themselves. Now, the term willful has been defined in law as deliberately doing something which is wrong, knowing it to be wrong, or with reckless indifference as to whether it is wrong or not. Now, this second element of the offence is wide-ranging, and there are a variety of things that can constitute willful neglect or misconduct. Some of the examples outlined to indicate this type of behaviour are a local authority manager improperly arranging for contractors to carry out work at their partner's home, a police officer accessing the police national computer and then passing that information gathered to a criminal, or a prison officer passing information to journalists for payment. Now, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, the alleged willful neglect to perform their duty is that the decisions taken by Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, or indeed the failure to take decisions at the appropriate time, the lack of a cohesive plan, and the reported chaotic nature in which the government was being run would constitute willful neglect or willful misconduct. This is where I think a charge of misconduct in a public office falls down. If you firstly consider that the prosecution are required to prove each and every element of an offence of misconduct in a public office so that a jury is sure, the defence from both Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock is that they accept that mistakes were made in some of the decision making, but this was an unprecedented situation where the science was not clear. We as a country had never faced anything like this in living memory, and that there were consequences for taking or not taking decisions at the time that they did. Now, I do not say any of this to defend either of them. I'm simply highlighting the difficulty a prosecutor would have in proving that either of the individuals willfully neglected their duty or willfully misconducted themselves. Now, I've purposely not mentioned Partygate, which I've put to one side, which I know causes a lot of hurt for people who have lost loved ones and were not allowed to see them in their final moments. But that was dealt with in the case of Boris Johnson by way of a fixed penalty notice under the laws created at the time, and a decision was taken by the police after investigation that there was insufficient evidence to justify any further fixed penalty notices for any other parties that were held at Downing Street at the time. My focus in this video is to see whether or not the decision making of Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock amounts to an offence of misconduct in a public office. The third element of the offence of misconduct in a public office further qualifies the second element by saying essentially that it is not enough to simply willfully neglect your duty or misconduct yourself. The accused must do so to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder. Now, misconduct must amount to an affront to the standing of the public office held, and the threshold is a high one requiring conduct so far below the acceptable standards as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder. Now, those personally affected, having lost loved ones, will understandably point to the more than 200,000 deaths that have occurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. Each death is, of course, an absolute tragedy, but perhaps not every death was avoidable. The question would be, was the decision-making so poor by both individuals that it meets the very high standard of being to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust? Again, given the unprecedented nature, it would be difficult for a prosecutor to show that there was such flawed and poor decision-making that it amounted to an abuse of the public's trust. Now, this is not me backing up the Conservative Party line of "we got all the big calls right." What I am saying is that it would be clearly a very difficult situation to manage in the COVID-19 pandemic, and I am not convinced that there has been sufficient evidence to show that either individual willfully misconducted themselves or breached their duty, let alone to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder. Were big mistakes made? Probably. Does that make those mistakes criminal under this offence? I do not think so, based on the evidence that is in the public domain. The final element of the offence is to show that the accused acted without reasonable excuse or justification. Now, in the context of Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock, this has sort of been covered earlier in the video under elements 2 and 3. The fact that mistakes were made, and some of them big mistakes were made, can be attributed to the unprecedented nature of the situation faced during the COVID-19 pandemic, rather than any willful neglect or misconduct on the part of Boris Johnson or Matt Hancock. Now, I do not say any of this to defend either of them. What I am merely doing is highlighting the difficulties a prosecutor would face in demonstrating to a jury that, given the crisis, that either of them acted in a way to deliberately cause harm to the public, such as can be proven so that a jury is sure. So to summarise, there are 4 elements to the offence of misconduct in a public office. With regards to Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock and their handling of the pandemic, I do not believe that there is sufficient evidence in the public domain for a prosecutor to show that they willfully neglected their duty or willfully misconducted themselves to such an extent as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in their office. Again, I do not say any of this to defend either of them, but when you factor in the unprecedented nature of the pandemic, the ever-changing science, and the requirements to take or not take decisions which have consequences either way, I think it's difficult to demonstrate that the elements of the offence have been proven so that a jury is sure. That's it for this video. I'd be keen to know what you think about my opinion. Do you disagree? There's probably plenty of people much smarter than me that will disagree with my opinion. That's absolutely fine. If you did enjoy this video, then please do consider giving it a like. And if you'd like to see more from me, then please do subscribe to my channel. Thanks for watching. Take care.